Our second panel for today, racialized paradigms and minoritized populations in the ancient and medieval Middle East. We'll have two papers. The first will be given by Jesse DeGrotto at the University of Michigan. Jesse is the Assistant Professor of Ancient Middle Eastern Studies, and by Hila Dang, who is the Renard Professor of Islamic Studies at St. Louis University. Jesse's paper, Ancient Alterity, Modern Racialization, Language, Culture, and the Construction of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, will be leading off our panel. You could just share this. No, it's getting my
Okay. The empires of ancient Iraq did not have a conception of race, at least not as it is commonly construed today. For over 2,000 years of recorded history, there is no evidence that Mesopotamian states categorized populations based primarily on phenotypical or linguistic difference, nor did they consider these differences to be hereditary and stable. All right, so that's the introduction to the abstract that I initially submitted for this conference. After reading other papers and contributions, and especially after last night's keynote and conversation, I'm rethinking my statement. Specifically, there may be processes of constructing alterity in Mesopotamia that could be usefully studied under the rubric of racialization. I think this is food for future thought. At present, I'm hesitant to adopt the category of race, even as a heuristic for Mesopotamia. And this is because the scholarly and public image of Assyria is still steeped in 19th century racial categories. And this has a direct effect on how we now conceptualize Assyrian treatment of foreign populations. At its base, the common assertion that Assyria was uniquely brutal among ancient empires stems from Assyria's characterization as Semitic in its essence. So today I'll explore two interrelated issues. First, I argue that the remarkable persistence of this Orientalist paradigm results, at least in part, from an overly hasty attempt to separate the category of race from language and culture. In practice, this has paradoxically obscured the role racialization plays in the constitution of linguistic and cultural categories in modern discourse. The result is that Mesopotamian states are still imagined in ways that are indebted to 19th century racial categories. So if you've heard Assyria described as uniquely brutal, you're already familiar with this. In the second half of this paper, I consider how the empire's status as prototypical Oriental despot shapes our reconstructions of cultural interaction under Assyrian hegemony. Scholars have tended to focus on how the Assyrian state either repressed or demonized difference. Through a brief foray into Assyrian palace art, I argue instead that the Neo-Assyrian Empire curated and instrumentalized human difference to constitute new subjects of their universal empire. 19th century philologists, as I'm sure you know, organized world history according to two racialized poles, Aryans and Semites. This schema grew out of attempts at genealogical classification, which assumed that speakers of a language family shared an ancestry, something we've seen just in Jimmy's previous talk. In the 19th century epistemological framework, this meant related languages could be traced to an original race that spread out across the world. On this basis, scholars constructed a series of binaries that characterized Aryan and Semitic culture. Aryans were spiritual, cultured, and capable of enlightened governance. Semites, by contrast, were superstitious, legalistic, and despotic. This classificatory system, bound up in European colonial ambitions, created a problem. How could one reconcile the development of agriculture and writing in the ancient Middle East with the assertion of inherent European superiority? The tension was alleviated with the realization that the earliest inscriptions from Mesopotamia were not written in a Semitic language at all. After a brief debate, it was determined that Sumerian was neither Aryan nor Semitic. The constitution of Sumerians as a distinct population group with a non-Semitic background set the stage for the framing of over 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history writing. In this reconstruction, the highly cultured Sumerian inhabitants entered the region from the outside, mixed with Semitic inhabitants, and were eventually overtaken by migrations of additional Semitic groups. Within this schema of successive mixing, the Sumerians could be credited with the development of civilization, and Semitic Mesopotamians were responsible for its eventual decline. The process was imagined in 3 stages. It's laid out very explicitly in the writings of Archibald Henry Sayce, who was a student and colleague of Friedrich Max Müller. Summarizing a growing consensus, Sayce wrote of this first stage, Eridu and Nippur alike owed their origin to a race, which we will term Sumerian. The primitive civilization of Babylonia was their creation. They were the founders of its great cities and temples, the inventors of the pictorial system of writing, out of which the cuneiform characters subsequently developed, the instructors in culture of their Semitic neighbors. The invention of a distinct Sumerian race thus allowed scholars to credit a non-Semitic people with what they saw as a dawn of civilization. The subsequent course of Mesopotamian history was set by the successive influx of Semitic peoples. For some scholars, such as Hugo Winkler, the Semitic influx was assumed to be violent and appropriative, obscuring the true Sumerian origins of civilization. But others, including Sayce, imagined a slower progress that resulted in a burst of creativity, followed by a decline. And so Sayce here. Mixed races are invariably the best, and the Babylonians were no exception to the rule. We have only to compare them with their neighbors, the more purely blooded Semitic Assyrians, to assure ourselves of the fact. The culture of Assyria was but an imitation and reflection of that of Babylonia. There was nothing original about it. The Assyrians excelled only in the ferocities of war, not in the arts of peace. Although Sayce does not express a desire for racial purity that characterizes other scholars, his vision of history is racialized. It establishes a binary opposition between civilized Sumer and despotic Assyria, with Babylonia occupying middle space. The basic paradigm of Semites and Sumerians has continued to plague scholarship for most of the 20th century and into the 21st. In an introductory essay on Mesopotamian literature, W.G. Lambert emphasized the non-Semitic origins of Mesopotamian culture. This is going to sound familiar. The first great civilization in Mesopotamia was that of the Sumerians. They established a pattern of civilization, the influence of which lasted for many centuries after the Sumerians themselves had been absorbed into the infiltrating Semites. From the Sumerians, the later Babylonians took over their system of writing, much of their religion, and some of their literature. Although he refrained from explicit comments on the superiority or inferiority of Semitic-speaking peoples, Lambert continues a tradition of conflating language, ethnicity, religion, and literary culture. Many of Lambert's contemporaries did push back on explicit linguistic racial classification. Nonetheless, they continued to hew to the same trajectory of Mesopotamian history that was initially put forward under the racialized paradigm. In 1839, Thorkild Jacobsen published a decisive rebuttal of the prevalent hypothesis that speakers of Sumerian and Akkadian represented 2 coherent population groups locked in a perpetual struggle between races. His subsequent history of Mesopotamian religions, Treasures of Darkness, makes no mention of a transition from Sumerian to Semitic culture. Nonetheless, Jacobsen's general sketch of Mesopotamia in history hews to this same general trajectory of Mesopotamian religious development under Sumerian and Babylonian hegemony and eventual degradation, courtesy of the Assyrians. Since Jacobsen was a devoted structuralist fond of charts, I've taken the liberty of illustrating his schema of the evolution of Mesopotamian religion. The first thing to note here is that while formally critiquing racialized categories, Jacobsen still imagines a form of social evolution in which scholars can judge how primitive or advanced a religious culture is. Second, although he does not use the underlying linguistic or racial schema that I've given for you below with Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian, his actual evaluations closely follow the trajectory laid out by Sayce. Here, the linguistic shift from Sumerian to Babylonian maps onto the positive period of development that Sayce credited to mixed races. Meanwhile, religion declines to unspeakable depths under Assyrian hegemony. And this is like so unspeakable that Jacobsen devotes barely 2 paragraphs to Assyria in the entire book. Jean Bottero likewise eschews any attempt to disentangle the culture or ethnicity of Sumerian versus Akkadian speakers. Yet his work remains likewise indebted to earlier paradigms. Despite explicitly stating that the Sumerians and Semites are not coherent ethnic groups, he continues to refer to Semitic influence on Mesopotamian culture. Treatments of Orientalism in Mesopotamian studies have also generally overlooked how scholars like Jakobsen and Bottero implicitly relied on the racialized categories they critiqued. In an article on the effects of Orientalism in Assyriology, Eckhart Fromm presents Jakobsen's approach as an antidote to that of Wolfram von Soden. Here, things get a bit complex. Von Soden was indeed a card-carrying Nazi, and he celebrated what he saw as a violent spirit of Assyrian literature. This actually required quite a bit of mental gymnastics for von Soden, who had to posit a secret Aryan influx into Assyria. In discussing changes in the field following the Second World War, Fromm explains, now, the Semitic character of the Assyrians was no longer a problem, but their bellicosity, imperial ambitions, and autocratic political system, earlier regarded as legitimate and laudable, were seen as highly objectionable. In this quote, we see again the persistence of a paradigm that is simultaneously disavowed. The image of Assyria as uniquely bellicose and despotic is itself deeply indebted to 19th century portrayals of Oriental despotism, which were inextricably linked to the identification of Assyria as Semitic. The fact that von Soden celebrated these same characteristics has more to do with the divergence of Orientalist and anti-Semitic rhetoric in Germany than anything else. So for von Soden, the image of the Semite was one of weakness and mercantilism, not the bellicose ferocity that imbued earlier characterizations of Assyria as Semitic. Thus, when Fromm suggests that the problem scholars had with Assyria now, or have now, is their bellicosity, imperial ambitions, and autocratic political system, he is simply reverting to an earlier Orientalist vision of Assyria. Put simply, Fromm attributes to Assyria the quintessential components of Oriental despotism, while inadvertently obfuscating the basis for this attribution. This results in the assertion of a racialized paradigm that has become so deeply entrenched, it is no longer recognized for what it is. I could give you some additional examples of Assyriologists and biblicists alike recycling Orientalist paradigms without recognizing their origin, but these are actually relatively easy to spot once you know what to look for. So the next time you see a claim that Assyrians are warlike, lacking in culture, simply imitating Babylonia, or otherwise uniquely evil or despotic, just run away screaming. More pernicious is the role of racialization in the work of contemporary scholars who have adopted the mantle of philology. Many of these scholars are actively constructing new racialized paradigms, not just recycling earlier ones. Here, I want to differentiate the discipline of philology from that of historical linguistics, which describes changes in phonology, morphology, and syntax. And I also want to distinguish it from object history or text criticism, which attend to processes of transmission. These are obviously worth studying, and they can stand on their own without the problematic moniker of philology. I want to turn to an example of a recent work that makes clear how philology, as it is often practiced, continues to carry the torch of linguistic essentialism under the guise of rigor. In a recent book, Seth Sanders attempts to trace the development of anti-authoritarian politics to a specific linguistic community. This application falls into a broader category of scholarship that approaches the problem of the Semitic character of the Hebrew Bible, not by deconstructing the underlying paradigm, but simply by shifting its boundaries so that ancient Israel can be claimed as an antecedent of either Western civilization or some other contemporary value. And this is actually very similar to the process that Jimmy just highlighted for us, in which the Assyrians were made not Asiatic without challenging the underlying problematic schematization. So in practice, this always plays out in convoluted and contradictory ways. Sanders in particular criticizes early conflations of linguistic and political communities before going on to posit a fundamental model of collaborative politics and anti-authoritarian ideals baked into West Semitic communities. His usage of the label West Semitic is particularly troubling, and not only because it imputes a set of political norms to a linguistic group. In fact, the category of West Semitic is itself a scholarly construct. It is a classificatory label that explains the phonological and morphosyntactic relationship between actually attested languages. At the level of historical linguistics, this type of classification can be and is useful. But to imagine a specific population behind the academic construct is to engage in the worst aspects of linguistic genealogical classification. Supposing we can trace languages backwards to an originary group with identifiable cultural and religious commitments. Thus, even as he explicitly critiques the conflation of language and nationality, Sanders' own reconstruction of ancient Middle Eastern history hinges on the racialization of linguistic communities. Here, I'm using racialization to encompass a broad set of processes by which specific characteristics are imputed to entire populations based on genealogical classification, including linguistic genealogy. Sanders' work may not look precisely like the models of scientific racism we're all familiar with, in which fundamental differences are attributed at the level of biology. But it is unclear to me how precisely we can align the ideal of collective politics with the linguistic construct of West Semitic without engaging in the same types of essentialism that drive processes of racialization. Of course, the construction of a West Semitic political ideal of collaborative politics must have a foil. And for Sanders, that comes in the form of imperialism imposed by Mesopotamian speakers of East Semitic languages. It's convenient that West and East happen to map in this way. By associating these ideals with proto-linguistic communities, Sanders would seem to cement Assyrian imperial ambitions in the hoary past. This is deeply problematic, and it is also demonstrably false. There was nothing inherent to the Assyrian language or culture that necessitated a turn towards empire. In fact, in the early second millennium BCE, the city of Ashur was run by a collective city assembly that had a rotating head or limu. This means that the move toward kingship and eventually empire in Assyria did violence not only to the communities conquered, but actually to the pre-existing political structures and communities within Assyria itself. So what are the implications of this legacy of racialization for understanding how the Neo-Assyrian Empire actually classified heterogeneous populations? The effects of racialization and Orientalism persist here, in my view, in primarily two ways. First, in our propensity to see Assyrian characterizations of foreigners as primarily negative, which is, I think, a conditioning just from our general educations. The second problem arises in terms inherited from earlier generations of archaeologists and art historians who were directly applying tools of racialization, such as phrenology, to statues. And there was actually a crisis when they were first discovering Sumerian because they found a headless statue with a Sumerian inscription, and the archaeologists were instructed to just go search, dig as fast as you can and find that head so we can know what race this is. These assumptions bias us toward interpretations that portray human difference as both immutable and sinister. In fact, because Assyrians did not consider culture or ethnicity constitutive of citizenship, their approach to difference is better seen as instrumentalized. In this respect, the Assyrian understanding of human diversity shares much in common with the way the empire treated other types of difference, ranging from topographic variation to biodiversity. From the imperial vantage point, each of these elements had the potential to be classified and tamed rather than destroyed outright, in a way that highlighted the unparalleled extent of the Assyrian Empire. And I'm still thinking now through whether these classification systems can be sort of subsumed under a rubric of racialization in a productive way. So this is something that I'm continuing to work on. To illustrate how the Assyrian approach to difference works, we're going to turn to a specific scene preserved in the throne room courtyard of Sargon's palace at Khorsabad, built in the late 8th century BCE. The reliefs afford the visitors a bird's eye view extending from an island city in the west to the king's reception of tribute at the palace. The full extent of the facade frames a door at center with an image of the Assyrian king facing outward on either side of the door. To the right of the door, the king's gaze reaches to the Mediterranean, where seafarers are depicting hauling lumber in flat-bottomed boats propelled by oars. Laden vessels proceed to the shore, where barefoot workmen in short kilts drag the lumber in teams and stack the beams in orderly piles beneath an acropolis. Here, foreignness is indicated by the landscape itself, including the rocky island city, as well as the caps donned by workmen and their short, slightly triangular beards. On the left side of the same facade, another likeness of the Assyrian king receives a line of foreign tributaries, depicted with caps and coiffures that match those of the Phoenician or Syro-Anatolian lumber workers. In contrast to their working contemporaries, however, these individuals are decked in finery, including long ornate kilts with scallop trim and tassels, and high boots. Their tributes include bowls, burgeoning wineskins, not depicted here are camels, and we even see these little model cities representing their submission. These all provide authenticating details, showing the unique clothing, products, and architecture of the western extent of the empire. Taken as a whole, Sargon's seascape can be seen as an attempt to limit control over a quadrant of the known world, extending from the Assyrian heartland to the Mediterranean Sea, and encompassing both maritime trade and aquatic species, mythical and mundane. The scene adorned an external wall of the palace in a large courtyard. During the palace's inaugural banquets and short-lived tenure as the Assyrian capital, the relief would have provided foreign dignitaries with an alternative to the gory battle scenes, showing the fate of rebellious enemies. There are certain respects in which Assyrian instrumentalization of human difference really is similar to Euro-American approaches to empire. Exoticism is a core tool of modern empire building, and this was used to its fullest extent by Assyria. But for Assyria, the exotic differences were not indicative of a mutable or sinister difference. Rather, they indexed the universal extent of the Assyrian Empire by showing the diversity of territories subservient to the Assyrian king himself. In this respect, the Assyrian view of difference is simultaneously inclusive and highly politicized. Anyone can belong, provided they pay the tribute on time. Understanding the way Assyrian Empire capitalized on diversity can complicate the contemporary tendency to sharply differentiate between exoticism, which is associated with imperialism, and diversity, which is framed as a marker of multicultural humanism. Instead, the Assyrian example shows how structures of hegemony can employ positive portrayals of human difference to reinforce a particular political or economic system. In this respect, even as Assyrian approaches to difference may not necessarily be racialized, there are good parallels with the modern world. We can compare Assyrian images with other methods of harnessing diversity for profit, such as the glossy multiculturalism of Coca-Cola commercials, and even the marketing of post-colonial novels. As Sarah Ahmed has argued in her study of diversity in higher education, contemporary institutions instrumentalize diversity as a containment strategy that transforms unruly groups into marketing assets under a rubric of multiculturalism. The work I've just shared with you about Assyrian classification in particular is based in large part on a paper that I published in 2019 that aimed to counter Orientalist readings of Assyria. So just 4 years later, turn on my microphone. All right, so just 4 years later, I can already see ways in which my own work was still reliant on racialized categories. In the paper, I use the term physiognomy to refer to phenotypical differences among populations in Assyrian art. This language is still employed in art history, which is disturbing, and it actually reinscribes the naturalness of modern racialized categories. And thus it indicates the exact opposite of what I wanted to say. Using words like physiognomy reinforce the idea that there exist meaningful types of physical difference among people that lead inevitably to certain types of groupings. In fact, the phenotypical differences that Assyrians selected to show human diversity, like their perceptions of dress and language, may not map onto the boundaries that we have drawn today. So the problem here goes beyond my use of a dated term. Contemporary audiences are, for example, primed to look at the nose or lips as a location of meaningful classificatory difference, but no such attention is given to ears or hands. What this means is that we are already primed to recognize certain artistic variation as indicating ethnic difference, while we may remain oblivious to other ways of classifying human bodies. This requires a thorough rethinking of how we identify classification and visual representation, which is something I am still considering. Assessing the legacy of racism in ancient history requires a commitment to reevaluating work, not only the work of others, but also our own. In the talk today, I've traced the way processes of racialization continue to influence the field of ancient Middle Eastern history and explored one way that deconstructing underlying paradigms can help us write better, more accurate, and more interesting histories. There's clearly much more work to be done, and I'm really looking forward to additional conversations with you all.
I don't have any fun pictures. Sorry. Well, maybe he's. So I hesitated to even discuss this topic, and you'll see it's a bit rambling in its presentation. It's not as well thought out as I would like it to be, but I'm hoping to actually use this as a workshop, to really think through some of these ideas, which are relatively new for me. So the entangled Iran, ethnicity, religion, and race in Iranian studies. Fancy title I've given the talk, but I just want to start with the things that might be familiar to you. But in 1935, Reza Shah, Persia, changed the name of Persia to Iran in recognition of the ancient name of the empire, as for example used by the Sasanian Persians, who ruled Persia or Iran. Sorry, I'm going to confuse these terms a lot today, but from the mid-3rd century until the 7th century. That's who I'll be talking about mostly today. But in any case, the Sasanian Persians referred to the land of the Iranians or the Aryans. In fact, what the Sasanian Persians had called in Middle Persian, Iran Shah. So that same year, 1935, the Shah also began a program to purge the Persian language of Arabic and Turkish loanwords in order to return the language to its more pure Aryan linguistic roots as a descendant of the Indo-European language family and relatedly its peoples or race, right? So later, then in 1967, his successor, Mohammad Reza Shah, would take the title Shahanshah, the Persian King of Kings. And in 1976, he celebrated 2,500 years of Persian rule, beginning with Cyrus the Great. So although Iranians have been primarily Shi'i Muslims for centuries, the Pahlavi regime also promoted secularized symbols of Zoroastrianism in nationalist propaganda, including this, the Favahar, this image here from the Achaemenid Persian inscriptions, who were debatably Zoroastrian, right? Okay. So anyways, already just with these quotes here, which I'm not going to read in full, you can see the range of contexts in which some kind of Iranian identity is or has been invoked and employed. And I don't intend to cover them all today. Like, it would be a very ambitious project. But I am interested in this concomitant perception of the continuity of the distant past, right? Particularly in reference to pre-Islamic Zoroastrian religion. And this perception of continuity appears in modern scholarship, both implicitly and explicitly, in a spectrum ranging from a sort of altruistic appreciation of the endurance of a marginalized community in spite of all odds, right? The Zoroastrians are still around today. And here's a couple, like famous books like Zoroastrianism, its Antiquity and Constant Vigor. Right? These are things. And some more recent ones as well. So a whole range, right? Not just that aggrandizing state propaganda and modern nationalist appeals to the Aryan myth, but popular secular appropriations of Zoroastrian symbols, rituals, and traditions. And so whereas scholars of modern Iran have been grappling with the legacy of this Aryan myth in contemporary Iranian nationalist politics, where modern notions of Iranian identity are employed in the exclusion and marginalization of non-Persian others, and the promotion of an ideal of Iranianness that is tied to a construction of the past glories of Iran, like these authors here work on. In contrast, scholars of the ancient or late antique Iran studiously avoid the topic or even the word race, probably because of this specter of the Aryan myth, right? That's still looms large in the history of the discipline. But what is discussed to no end is, by scholars of antiquity, is the nature of Iranian identity. Like, there's so many, books and articles on this subject as a tool of ancient imperial authority, and the prominence of the religious aspect of this identity, as well as the role of Zoroastrianism as the so-called state church of the Sasanians, the dynasty, that I mentioned. It's called the state church because of its ideological association with the foundation of that dynasty, but also the increased hierarchization of the Zoroastrian clergy in the later centuries of Sasanian rule. I'm using these scare quotes, because already you can see that the problems with talking about it in terms of Roman West Christianity, right? We're still kind of working through this in the field. But anyways, my goal for today is to sort of reintroduce the idea of race and racism to the notion of Iranian identity in the Sasanian period, to theorize the role of religion in this construction of difference that is racecraft or race making. And I do this very tentatively because, as our keynote speaker addressed yesterday, there are real concerns, like many of you have addressed already too, with appropriating or misapplying these concepts, especially in the past. So I'll explain a bit about how I'm sort of seeing it, but maybe challenge, like, should I be doing this at all? So I'll, to say a bit more about this idea of Iranian identity and scholarship, then I'm gonna also get to a few accounts written by what I might consider racialized, minoritized imperial subjects of the Persians, and how I think that these sources demonstrate how different non-Zoroastrian religious communities under Persian rule sort of internalized and negotiated or even rejected notion of a sort of inherited religious identity. Okay, so just to briefly kind of go through, okay, in the past few decades, and in response to these modern nationalist Iranian discourses, scholars of ancient Iran have produced these articles, books, chapters devoted to this topic, the idea of Iran. It's sometimes called a whole series about this, Iranian identity, and specifically tracing the concept from the Avestan word and Middle Persian one. So first, I just kind of wanted to show this Achaemenid inscription, and then where these words appear on the later Sasanian one on the same site, Nakshirostam. But the words themselves, right? So on the far right is the Avestan Arya, going back or used in this term, the Aryan Abijah, which is the mythical homeland of the Aryan peoples in the Avesta, as well as in the old Persian inscriptions of Darius from the 6th century BC. He uses this term. Well organized here. He calls himself an Aryan, having an Aryan lineage, right? Lineage, like we're not going to use the word race there. Okay. But then later Middle Persian, which is actually singular, which is Iran. And then they also use this formulation of Iran Shar, the land of the Iranians or Aryans. Okay. So scholars tend to see this signification and as an innovation of the Sasanians, who are credited with transforming the concept from a primarily ethnic or geographic one to a political and religious one. Now, Zoroastrian exegetical texts from the Sasanian period do seem to confirm this idea that Iran held a religious meaning. So the Zand being the, translations, but also commentaries of Avestan texts in later Middle Persian. We don't know exactly when, but sometime in this. So you see texts like this Yash, which is a hymn, will have this phrase, the land of the Aryans, and then it is translated, quite literally as the land of the Aryans, but then also sometimes further glossed or even translated as Mazdasan, Mazda worshiper. Similarly, as I fix this slide, so another term would be the Wehdenan, those of the good religion, as a translation for Iran, right? And as an opposite to this, on air used as a gloss on demon worshippers as well. So it is a religious notion in religious texts, right? That should seem maybe obvious, but again, much of the scholarship on Iranian identity then is about determining which lands, regions, or peoples were considered by the Sasanians at various times to be Iran as opposed to on Iran. And the nature of that inclusion or exclusion from Iran Shar as some combination of geographical, political, religious, cultural, linguistic membership. Now, the second type of discussion engages with Iran or Iranian as an identity and seeks to draw or redraw the boundaries of inclusion, usually with an interest in establishing the nature and scope of Sasanian persecutions of Christians. So the inclusion within Iran Shar comes to denote, like I said, primarily religious and political membership, even proto-citizenship, right? But we're not talking about Rome, so talk about citizenship for some, but others emphasize the Persian culture and language. Now, I think that the focus of scholarship and the repeated attention given to this idea of Iran suggests that there's an idea among scholars that such dialogues are not a part of modern discourses on race and or Iranian nationalism, that good philology and good historiography kind of stands on its own and doesn't need to address these discourses and their implications for people today. However, the avoidance of the word race in such scholarship doesn't avoid the problem when the use of ethnicity and identity instead kind of serve the same purpose, and both are linked to religion and imperial control. But the problem, as I see it, is that this continuing discussion has contributed to perceptions of both the ahistoricity of this static identity of what Zoroastrianism is, and the ahistoricity of its homogeneity. So in other words, I think we've completely bought Sasanian imperial Zoroastrian priestly propaganda about the role of the religion and its authorities. So I think that thinking with the notions of race and racism might be generative for understanding or explaining this continuing appeal to continuity in scholarly and popular conceptions of Zoroastrianism, which implicitly assume the conservatism and orthodoxy of its post-Sasanian traditions through narratives of genealogy and the inherited or heritable, I use that word, religious identities, what we might consider a racialized discourse of religious transmission. So rhetoric and ideology that then obfuscate the complex and contextualized processes, or I get really wordy when I'm like thinking through, of the transmission of religious knowledge, which conceal a great deal of variety of religious expression that we know must have existed in the past. So then can we even talk about race? And how do we go about thinking about it and these relationships between Zoroastrians and non-Zoroastrian, sort of as relational or even racialized? So just again, before I do that, the introduction last night by Daniel was amazing. And yes about everything he was saying. And some of our discussions today continuing, right? So thinking about race and racism as this social construct, linked to systems and structures of power, but also using it as a lens for understanding this imperial authority in the past. Like some of these scholars in classics in particular, I didn't have time to talk about this, but these are very important and rather nuanced ways to talk about Iranian identity. I'm not saying it's all garbage out there. There's a lot of good stuff, but what can we bring to the conversation by talking about race? So following some scholars in classics and medieval studies, they've argued that race certainly does exist in antiquity. It doesn't matter if there wasn't a word for it or even a concept of it in the modern, discussed 19th and 20th century sense of the word and its constructs, but we can still study it through its effects, what the fields have termed racecraft, referring not to groups or to ideas about groups' traits, but to mental terrain and pervasive belief, even a kind of fingerprint evidence that racism has been on the scene. And I also want to point to this assessment by Jackie Murray that I've included up here, who says also that race is not determined according to criteria of skin color or any somatic feature, but as categories of social hierarchy determined by an ideology of oppression and put in terms of relational distance from sameness. So that's like what I'm operating with here, relational distance from sameness. And I can kind of skip over some of this rest of this because we've talked about it a lot today already. But on to this point about, and this is what I'm not sure about, right, is whether or not we can think of religious identity in these terms, especially for what I'm calling its heritability, a term which rightly refers to genetic transmission of a trait, but which I'm using to think about the conceptualization of religious inheritance, also called patrimony in some of the sources I'm going to discuss, and imagined through often constructed genealogies. So this is a religion's ability to be inherited from one's parents, and furthermore, the notion that it always is, as a matter of fact, like whether legal or social or something, at least as it's imagined. And we know that religion is heritable in a way, right? But not because of any inherent quality of it, but because of practices of education, indoctrination, the sociology of religion. But thinking of heritability as a racialized form of religious transmission allows us to talk about the construction and perpetuation of that identity, or its subversion, as I hope to show, on the part of minoritized subjects, as well as its transference outside of imperial context. So like the end of Sasanian rule, it's still kind of operating. And outside of religious context too, when many Iranians become Muslim, for instance, and are still buying into a sort of secularized or Islamicized version of this kind of religious identity. Which I don't have time, it's a much bigger, further project, right? So anyways, I think I'll move on now to a couple of these Zoroastrian Middle Persian texts. No, I'm not going to talk about the Zoroastrian Middle Persian texts today, actually. They're useful, problematic in various ways, and that's a much larger discussion, but I'm going to move to some non-Zoroastrian sources from the Sasanian period in order to examine the way that what I'm calling a sort of imperial argument about religious identity and its heritability are represented and contested by subjects, and they do it differently from each other. Okay, so not going to talk about these. We're going to move on to these. Okay. I'm going to first look at a martyrdom account from a group of texts known collectively as the Acts of the Persian Martyrs, or the Persian Martyr Acts, PMA. Then I'm going to compare the Eastern Syriac Christian perspective in those texts to some in Armenian texts, including the Armenian translation of Persian Martyr Act. So this collection of texts, the Persian Martyr Acts, their classification and organization has been under recent critique and review. But anyways, they're mostly written in Syriac in the 5th through the 7th centuries, and they describe the heroic martyrdoms of Persian Christians from as early as the 4th century during the reign of Shapur II. Now, the PMA contained views polemical towards the religious beliefs and practices of the ruling Zoroastrian elite, as well as a range of tropes that would have been familiar to audiences of Christian hagiography and martyrdom narratives. But with careful criticism, they're still useful for examining this mental terrain and sort of fingerprint evidence of imperial racecraft. And a recurring theme in several of these later acts is that the martyr rejects this imperial argument, as it were, of religious heritage or patrimony. For example, the martyr and convert Yazd Pana, he rejects what he calls the folly which I performed in the religion of my fathers. Similarly, in a Persian martyr act that was actually written in Armenian, the life of Yazd Bozid, they are the Magians or Zoroastrians in Din in Armenia. They plead with this martyr not to abandon his patrimonial Magianism, but he retorts that he renounces his patrimonial polytheism. Another example in the life of Hierarchies here, who's also called Mirma Gushnas. And this is a text that deserves its own full-length study because of its unique authorship and its role in the Christological controversies of that century. But the young martyr, or would-be martyr, even from a young age, he's skeptical of inheritance as well as royal, preference and authority as sufficient reasons for following his religion. The fact that it is an inheritance that is patrimonial, received from one's fathers. And then as a final example, and I didn't include the text, sorry, here, but in the life of Mar Ava, the Catholicos, who is a convert also from this Magian or Zoroastrian background, there are many charges against him, but the one that actually sticks in the end is the one of apostasy, right? That you used to be a pagan, but have only recently become a Christian. Now, that's a further discussion as well, the perspective of apostasy and conversion with all of this, and examining the Zoroastrian sources themselves, we get at it from a legal angle. But I just want to point out that the name, the Persian Martyr Act, is itself a sort of misnomer, because while the typical, geographical terminology of these texts places them within the land of the Persians in Syriac, the martyrs themselves are not usually referred to, if ever, I think, as Persian. So this is outside perspective in comparison to Roman Christian martyrs. And the distinction that's made most frequently in the Syriac Persian Martyr Acts is, perhaps unsurprisingly, one of religion. The Christians on the one hand and the Zoroastrians or Magians, Syriac Magushe on the other, who are also referred to as pagans as examples. And I don't even think the terms Iran or Iran Shah appear in the Persian Martyr Acts as well. It's sort of interior to this tradition. I don't know. But the Syriac Christians that authors these texts, they present something a bit different from the Armenian Christians. Now, Armenian literary works from this time regularly refer to the Sasanian king as the king of the Persians, right, as other, but within the Syriac text, he's just the king or the king of kings. So I'm thinking through a lot of these categories and haven't sort of figured them out yet. But I do want to point to something else then. The Armenian translation of Syriac Persian Martyr Act. Yeah, I don't know how much time I even have, but okay, sorry. Right, I skipped over something else that I don't have a slide about anyway. So forgive me. In the Armenian historiographies, right, there is a great deal of emphasis on their approach to patrimonial religion, but for them it's Christianity. They have been Christian for over a century by the time of the Armenian revolt in 450. And when the Persian king is asking them to perform acts of Zoroastrianism, like, no, our fathers are Christian. So you can see like a bit different perspective from outside of but still inside the Persian Empire, as opposed to the Syriac Christians here. Which I don't have time to get into further. But in any case, this idea of patrimony is such a feature of the Armenian religious identity that it augments their translation of the Bible in certain traditions, and this translation here of the Martyr Act. So what I want to highlight is that, well, first of all, this translation was supposed to have occurred in the 5th century by the Armenian bishop known as Abraham the Confessor. And one of the martyrdom acts that he translates is that of Simeon bar Sabai, whose Syriac martyrdom just served as a model for other martyrdom accounts later. But limited study of this translation, which deserves further study as well, it seems that the Armenian translation is relatively faithful to the Syriac original, but in a couple of instances, they add in a few things, right? So in this instance here, just where the original Syriac passage says something like, in the same way suffering came upon our people, the Armenian will say, well, it came upon the people of the Christians in the land of the East, and differentiating even in the translation. Or where this is a passage or quotation from Maccabees, which is hugely informative to this text, but they add in this phrase where it doesn't exist in the Syriac original, or even in, I think, modern Armenian versions of the Bible, to say that, let us die with a sincere heart for the sake of the laws of our fathers. Like that entire phrase is an addition. So you can see different approaches to that idea of a religion being sort of hereditary. So I'm not going to dive into those Christological controversies and decisions that's led to the separation of those churches today, but just thinking about, Abraham the Confessor was supposed to have been part of the group of Armenians who was a political prisoner after the war in 451. It's just kind of everything adds to these perceptions. Right. But what does this matter then in the end? It's coming back to the transmission of the Zoroastrian religion after the fall of the Sasanians, and how I see this as still productive. Well, later Zoroastrian priests would claim a genealogical relationship with their predecessors in often fabricated ways, as I try to discuss in my dissertation and other article. But the biggest problem with all of these sources is that they're literary texts and they're produced by religious institutions. And this might touch on something that came out in Jimmy's presentation today as well. They require further study of the discipline and self-reflection of the discipline in what has been preserved and what we're actually looking at. So all of those source problems are there, but also the scholarly focus on the religious aspects of Iranian identity, like I say, buy into that propaganda. And I think it sort of racializes the religion, making it inherent, teleological, the fact that it did survive, let's explain why in this way. And it makes the processes of transmission invisible and obscures those diachronic developments and moments of reinvention that I want to be able to focus on, that ongoing and active construction of memory. And I don't really have a conclusion besides that, because I need to keep working on this, or not at all, depending on what you guys want to. So I'll kind of stop there. I just put up this another later Zoroastrian text to show that maybe we actually could find semantic difference in conceptions of even religious identity, and then also much talked about hierarchies of social status within the Zoroastrian. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Kayla. So now, Catherine Davis, Marjorie M. Fisher, Professor of Egyptology in the Pharaonic period, will be offering a response.
Thank you. Sorry for that long title.
Alrighty. So first off, I do want to thank both Jesse and Kayla for such excellent and thought-provoking papers. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief because I'm sure that there are quite a lot of questions particularly because I think a lot of the themes that have already been talked about are now been built on. And so I'm going to try and tailor my response a little bit to bring in some of the really excellent points that some of your questions have brought up as well as the earlier papers. I'm also going to beg everyone's indulgence as I am an Egyptologist, and while the Neo-Assyrian Empire is in my temporal, if not geographical wheelhouse, the Sasanian Empire and most of everything else that has been discussed here is terribly modern. So there are a couple of key through lines that I think we've been circling around here, both in the two papers we've just heard, as well as in our other talks. And I want to look at those in a bit more detail and try to synthesize some of the things that we have talked about, as well as point to one or two areas where sort of the larger, both 19th century and early 20th century historiography of our fields, as well as looking at the late antique and ancient evidence of these various different regions, might have some interesting interactions with some Egyptian material. So the first thing that we have really sort of grappled with here today is that questions of race and racialization in the ancient and late antique past still often rely on the explicit or implicit racial categorizations of the 19th century scholars within this very particular Orientalist milieu. And in particular, that what we mean when we say 19th century and 20th century racial constructions is actually in and of itself highly contested ground. In one sense, yes, there is a very particular strain of biological racism that has a lot of its origins in, for example, the study of the human body, of biological somatic concerns tied into the American schools of anthropology, Glidden and not. We don't need to get into that. But there is another aspect that is often central to the ways in which racialized understandings of the past were developed. Oftentimes, linguistic hierarchies and the genealogical history of language was considered by many 19th century scholars a more verifiable and historical way to access the histories of these people that was often in dialogue with, but never fully overlapping, and often contested even within a single scholar's book, paper, much less over the body of their work. And so I want to point to sort of two things that I think both papers have brought out. From the Neo-Assyrian Empire, as Jesse has shown, the empire's enduring reputation of brutality is embedded in constructions of Semitic identity, where the linguistic categories of Semitic become essentialized, viewed as heritable, and ultimately slotted into this cultural hierarchy, where, of course, Indo-European / Indo-Germanic / Aryan, depending on who we're talking to and what like year of their paper we're talking about, are used. And then we have Semitic, and then we have basically everything else. But even as scholars, both in the 19th and 20th century, deny the primacy of somatic concerns, they are still engaging with questions of sort of somatic representations and the ways in which linguistic categories are heritable, which raises the specter of sort of biological questions. And that modern scholars are often sidestepping the explicit biological racism, fully acknowledging that it does not work in the same way for the ancient world, but bringing up questions of ethnicity or trucking in those same cultural and linguistic racial categories without acknowledging that those are tied into a broader spectrum here. And for the Sasanian Empire, as Kayla was talking about, this question of identity, Armenian identity entangled with the Aryan myth is of course also doing that. And just to give a sense of how contested these categories are, and very unstable even in the 19th and 20th centuries, the idea that, for example, Semitic is a category that is racialized, uniquely brutal, despotic, that is not imbued with the traits of creativity, the ability to reach the cultural heights that those who speak the Aryan languages are, is even problematized within ancient scholars of the 19th century. Because if we look at Egypt as an ancient culture is viewed as highly civilized, but the major problem for Egypt is less its connection to the Semitic world and more the specter of Africa. And in that sense, that for Egyptologists, aligning Egypt with the Semitic nature of the Near East is actually a way of associating Egypt with the cultural, civilizational, intellectual, artistic heights of what is then often perceived as white racial identity by excluding it from Black Africa. Now, the other sort of aspect that I think is being brought up here is this question of, all right, if we have all of these 19th and early 20th century ideas that still are exerting a legacy, how in fact do we look at the ancient and late antique past? And I think there's two really interesting ways that both Jesse and Kayla have brought this out. This question of exoticism, this question of how do the ancients see difference and how is it leveraged? And Kayla brought out, citing Murray, this idea of relational difference of sameness, and that when we look at sort of the perceptions in the ancient world of these various different groups, that there are ways in which the exertion of imperial power over diverse populations can emphasize differences in both somatic concerns, skin color, hairstyle, hair type, things that we recognize oftentimes as indexed to our modern concept of race, as well as a whole constellation of things that have to do with language spoken, dress, and other things that we do not pay attention to, as Jesse pointed out, if we're looking for modern conceptions of biological race, nose, and other things like that are things that we look at, whereas the ancients might perceive other bodily difference in ways. But that this is nonetheless a way of addressing a type of difference. And on the other hand, as Kayla's paper drew out, the role of religion within these imperial structures. And this idea that the idea of what makes a particular empire can be tied to heritable traits, and that religion is a heritable trait, much in the same way that in the 19th century idea, language can be a heritable trait and can bring with it a constellation of other features. And so I'm left with sort of two questions. One is that what is really this nature of the imperial state that we are talking about, a state that is not certainly modern, but is also not the Roman Empire, that what are the natures, how can we understand this state and the role that control and violence over populations played in a way that may or may not constitute a particular form of racecraft. And for the ancient peoples, this problematic concept of heritability that oftentimes is not made explicit when you're bringing in modern notions of heritability of traits, and not fully distinguish them from ancient concepts, and that both ancient and modern concepts of this nature of heritability are often incredibly complex, overlapping, and constitute a constellation of different forms. So obviously linguistic identity, but as Kayla is bringing out, religious identity. So I will end there so that we can open it up, because I'm sure many people have questions.
I think we're all supposed to sit at the table with the microphone in the middle so that it can our. Oh, yes, so that we're all in the box.
Would you like to respond first, or should we open it up?
I'm happy to just say a few words. I think the question of the relationship with anti-Black racism is really interesting. So when I teach undergrads, I will insist to them that Greece and Rome are part of the Middle East, but you can't do the same thing with Egypt necessarily because of the way that the rank, like the hierarchical ranking that we've inherited, puts Africa below Semitic, where Semitic is like the lowest tier of civilization of whiteness, right? And so to include Egypt in that is in a way denying its African connections, whereas it's a fun play for them to start thinking of Greece and Rome as Middle Eastern and sort of challenging the privilege, right, that's given to Greece and Rome as different.
Yeah, Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's also inevitably when you're talking about Egypt and these racial connections or conceptions, that there are many different aspects at play. There are, notions of identity between, there's often a disconnect that in Western European circles about the modern population of Egypt and the ancient population, as if there is a disconnect there. And that is something that is very difficult to fit into all of these conversations.
That's why I refuse to say Near East. Because it's implying, right, we need a different term for ancient and modern, which is a fundamental assertion of a discontinuity or break.
Yeah. And I will say too that, thinking about this, all of these discussions of erotic identity, and part of that also is an attempt to establish Sasanian studies as a field, right, in its own right, as distinct from and just as good as the study of Rome and Greece. But that doesn't mean it's not problematic. It's just it is a very real desire, and it's not just about philology. It's a historical field of inquiry. So, right.
Oh, okay. All right. So thank you for all of these very interesting papers. I want to direct my question to Jesse because I can speak to something that you might know about. So I'm wondering about ways alterity was conceived of in the ancient world. I think we've touched on all of them. There is perceived genetic descent or genealogical descent, whether fictitious or real. There is language, but I think we have many examples where language and belonging, or language and membership in a population group do not coincide explicitly. And then we have geographic designations. And so I guess I'm wondering, I want you to, can you talk about the Amorites for a moment? Because for a long time, because for example, we know I would say by the middle of the second millennium, they were largely assimilated, but there are nevertheless negative perceptions, perhaps even as literary fictions, but saying they live in tents, they're herders, they're different. They eat raw meat, yeah, for example. But nevertheless, in the course of the second millennium, we see that they're largely just settling and living alongside Babylonians. And so I wonder if there's perhaps some connection between the function of citizenship in the Roman world that we saw with Clifford Ando's presentation or something, that what if belongingness is much more about performance or is about how one conducts oneself, and that they conduct themselves in a civilized manner, and they're therefore belong as part of this.
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I'd say is that Amorites do not exist except for as a category that was invented for discursive purposes.
Yeah.
This is something that's sort of an ongoing discussion in the field. The people who are clinging to Amorite tend to be often influenced by the biblical migration schema and this need to find a population that moves and that can be sort of trace some sort of underlying biblical narrative. You really never have anyone say, I am an Amorite. So Amorite is being used to refer to probably a group of Northwest Semitic languages, like not a single language. So there's a linguistic element, and then there's also the pastoral element of people who are somewhat mobile, right, in some form of pastoralism. I think that is the primary mode of establishing alterity for much of Mesopotamian history, is a sort of pastoral versus urban divide, where the one time we get the sort of negative, the Amorites also have features of monkeys, for example, right? So we get the sort of dehumanization. It's happening with this group that's being called Amorite and that is extremely heterogeneous, right? I don't think we can ever find them in the record. The closest we can come is a kingdom of Amurru, which seems to be reclaiming this name. When I teach this to students, I put up signs from Dearborn in the English and the Arabic, where it'll say, like in Arabic, Aladdin family rugs, and then in English it'll say Oriental rugs. And so I think there are cases where this label is claimed by people who would be called Amorite by Mesopotamians, but we can't distinguish that from their choice to make themselves legible as a subject population. So in that sense, I think this would be a place where racialization may actually be somewhat appropriate because you have the construction of a category, but it is one that's practice-based and that is extremely permeable. And so that would be and that is not primarily linguistically driven, right? I don't think anyone would actually say people say Hammurabi was an Amorite. I think that's very silly. Hammurabi has a Northwest Semitic name, right? To say that that means that he's an Amorite is doing this sort of linguistic essentialism that we have a problem with. Yeah, so I think it's a sort of a floating signifier, and it's one that's being used differently in modern scholarship than it was by the Mesopotamians and by the population that reclaims the term.
Well, first I just want to say thank you to all of you for two great papers and a great response. I have a question for both of you, but I don't want to hog my time, so I'll start with one for now, for Kayla. And I wanted to mention, I thought it was so fascinating, the Armenian urge to write into Armenian translations of the Bible, the patrimonial laws and heritability and that kind of language, because, and I don't know if you've looked much at the life of Mashtots, the 5th century texts. So this is like the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, where he goes around first as this monk, and he's trying to convert people to Christianity and preach the Bible. And he goes to this one place, and he doesn't say what religion they are, but probably some kind of Zoroastrian.
That's in from us.
Yeah, and he basically says they were clinging to their patrimonial laws, and so I couldn't confirm them. And this is the basis for creating the Armenian alphabet in some way.
And he does this multiple locations through a program of like indoctrination. Like it's not just that people like we're going to take the children and teach them the language. Yeah, and I find lots of parallels in that. I really love.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too, because I mean I've never thought about it until you gave your paper. I don't know if race craft is quite right or wrong in this context, but it could be an interesting way of reframing the beginning of Armenian literary culture, not just to distinguish itself from, say, the Syriac church or the Greek church, but as this very anxious kind of response to this patrimonial heritability of the Sasanian world that is also gets written anxiously into the Bible too.
Yes. And like these are themes like I couldn't pull them out right, but in the Irish history and cliches as well, different pieces, slightly different terms, but it comes up all the time. So that's why I just started those. I think there's something there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a dialectic too. I'll have to quiet just a second, but there's a dialectic with the way that Armenian scholars have presented Armenian endurance throughout time, and it kind of mirrors the Iranian one. But it begins in this moment in a way where they got the alphabet and then they have the endurance to persevere.
And speaking of the alphabet, some people want to say, oh, maybe that's why the Persians started writing the Vesta. Because they came up, the invention of the Vestan alphabet, which reports oral tradition sometime in the Sasanian period. Maybe it was in response to the Armenian invention of the alphabet.
Scripts decouples language too, in an interesting way of thinking about other categories that we're not good at reading.
If I can be obnoxious and just jump in, because this question really brought to mind. So in Yahishe, there's this passage that I've always had trouble understanding. And he says, this is before the revolt in 451, there's like a collection of Armenian hierarchies, and they say the Persian emperor, or like the king of Iran, basically thinks that Christianity for us is like wearing clothing, but it is as if it is the same as the color of our skin. Mm-hmm. And so I just thought it was really helped. I'll send you that. Yeah, it's really fascinating for our conversations about masking or passing, but also what you're discussing about the racialization of religious practice in the Sasanian Empire. Thinking about,
and also on passing, sorry, in Zazar's version, right? The Armenians do swear the oath.
Yes, right.
In front of the king, but they swore oath on the Bible first to say that this was going to be a false oath, and then they go back with the Magian teachers and everything.
Yeah. So thanks for letting me jump in.
Can I jump in? Just say quickly, it's of course really important that it's in the Maccabees, right? So this is how Armenians are understanding themselves as Maccabeans. I mean, at least if we take time since work on that subject, so that's really important. Sorry.
Yes, I think, yes.
Quick response to the first paper and a question about the second. So the first, I mean, about the Sargon release, right? There's a long tradition of this, and I wonder, this is one of the earliest, but right in the ongoing tradition that you find in the Abadana, and then in various Roman representation. I wonder if one of the, I mean, I take it that it's one of the reasons to sustain a view of empire as diverse is precisely because at the level of figural representation, it's the easiest way to claim to be big.
Yeah.
And so even in Zoroastrian empire, even when you have an ideology that there's going to come some eschatological moment of world unity, nevertheless, you want to represent the empire as diverse now because it's your primary index of bigness, right? One of the sort of funny indices of the constructed nature of these categories, at least in Roman stuff, is that you move from representations in Rome of the empire as comprised out of conquered peoples. So the sculptures you find in the theater of Pompeii in Rome, or at least in literary accounts of it, to the kind of culminating representation of the empire as composed out of diverse peoples is in the provinces coin series of the Emperor Hadrian. But there's no ontology to the stupid province. And yet, in spite of then representing the empire as composed of these different peoples, of the provinces, each of which has its own characteristic garb. I mean, you could easily be in the Abadana. But not only that, but they begin to ascribe mores to provinces, as if the province was a cultural unit, which has its own modes. I mean, you find these legal claims, but in the most provinciae, it's just insane that they begin to ascribe to these administrative units this kind of ontology as a culture. About religion. I mean, why would you say religion is racialized as opposed to just when you say patrimony? I think instantly of property, and the language that's used of so-called private. I mean, so on Roman theory, there's a public religion which you derive from citizenship. So citizenship has specific religious entailments, and every person also has private religious obligations, which they receive from their fathers, as Cicero puts it. But why wouldn't it be received from one's father like a piece of property, which is what Cicero's and other Roman formulations suggest? And that.
I mean, I think it is that too. I didn't look at the legal texts today that talk about it in that way and have and other forms of inheritance.
But it is then fungible. I mean, if it's like an estate you inherit from your father, you can alienate it and get another. So the metaphorical operator says something.
Except that there's hierarchy. I didn't get to talk about all the passages. But what happens when you convert or apostatize in that sort of thing? Yes, it maybe your property and funds are dispersed differently than based on the religious identity, but there's hierarchy between being someone who is an Anaran versus a non-Iranian versus being someone who is who is of a bad religion. And it's hierarchized in such a way that I think we can't talk about it. Purpose. Sorry, I have more things that I could talk about. I
think it's a nice connection, right? What Jimmy brought up with the idea of religion as embodiment, as inalienable as color of skin, whether or not you can actually in practice like have this fungibility, right? This is like the fundamental problem of race as a construct, is that it's not real. And so it's always possible. These are always permeable barriers, right?
And then adding to that, so in some of the I had this short article by David Nuremberg, but he talks about, I think the book up there, but about how even when you convert, like there's still an impurity, right, of blood, like, and in later medieval tradition, and this specifically was about medieval Spain, but that is something that is passed on. as well. And then he also brings, maybe we can talk about this with the Shulubiyya movement. This is, you know, under the Abbasid, it was the Iranians who convert to Islam, and then their Islamists then what becomes a traditional like Sunni position. And it's still talked about this way today, I guess.
So mine is very, very basic question. I was very struck by how in Keda's paper, there was this thing of they're trying to get to an identity, Iranian identity, whatever that may be. But how it struck me that, Jesse, in your paper, while you talk about difference and how instrumentalizing difference, but what was the self-understanding of Assyrians? How do they define themselves? Yeah, I was wondering if is there a reason why I feel that just doesn't come out? It's kind of lighted. Is it not important?
It doesn't seem, I mean, really, there is a very expansive concept of what it means to be Assyrian.
So difference then is defined how?
So difference is like physical appearance, clothing,
Okay.
hairstyle, and this is being emphasized. That these are all people who, once you are part of the empire, like literally paying your dues to the empire is what makes you Assyrian. And they don't seem very interested, at least from the state documentary evidence we have, in denying the Assyrianness of these groups. So this is why I think similarly, like when they conquer a territory and they have this huge expanse, they actually create like little gardens to replicate the diversity of terrain. They have zoos where they're bringing in animals and they're actually like terraforming for the particular type of animal. And they're doing all of this so that they can visualize the extent of their empire, right? It's this bigness concept. And there just doesn't seem to be a hierarchy or ranking of these differences as somehow being not Assyrian. So there's also reliefs where they show their Assyrian army and they have them wearing their local costumes. Somebody brought up, there's Soviet era posters showing all the different workers in different costumes, right? And so there really seems to be like participating and paying, joining the army, participating in the Assyrian imperial project is what makes you Assyrian.
To add on to that as another like sort of parallel where you get really complicated notions of identity, polity to the south of Egypt is not a single polity, but known as Nubia, composed of lots of different, groups of people, various different structures throughout sort of the long array, 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. The Egyptians typically viewed the Nubians as one of like the classic enemies that they're always fighting. And yet basically from every moment of artistic and documentary records, Nubians are fighting in the Egyptian armies. And sometimes they are fighting against what the Egyptians are identifying as other groups of Nubians. Sometimes like a whole long laundry list of Nubians are included as fighting in other battles. There's all sorts of artistic imagery where the stereotypical image of the Nubian is different clothing, different hairstyle, depending on the time period. Occasionally feathers are involved in their hair, and of course much darker skin, but they are nonetheless doing the work of like they're Egyptian. And then you have individuals who we clearly see leveraging different visual appearances depending on the where we see them. Sometimes they're shown with much darker skin and carrying a bow, which is indexed as Nubian in Egyptian art. And sometimes they're shown with sort of a reddish brown skin, which is the typical way an Egyptian man would be portrayed, wearing a normal white kilt like an Egyptian. That's what we think.
Can I jump in? Oh, sorry. Just quick. So along the lines of the palace reliefs, I was really interested in scale and you talked briefly about how one could imagine oneself among these tribute bearers, which I think is really interesting. So I'm always wondering about that scale and then of course that depth, that shallow. But then the other question I had actually for you was about the line drawings you used. And I'm really interested in the degree to which, particularly those produced in the 19th and early 20th century, choose certain things to represent from the reliefs and omit others, and to what extent that contributes to the process of
So first on scale, it gets smaller as you're looking further towards the coast, right? So all of the, it's like actually a perspective. The Assyrians their art is not perspectival in a mimetic sense where they're trying to mimic exact perspective, but the sort of shrinking of the individual as you're looking out towards the seacoast is sort of giving the sense of space. The actual figures, if you have just one figure and a tribute relief, it's taller than a person.
Yeah.
And my favorite palace is actually at Kalhu as you're entering the throne room. It looks like you would actually basically queue up alongside images of these tributaries who are making the reverent posture. So if we're thinking of praxis and really habitus, I guess this would be another answer of what it means to be Assyrian is not just to pay, but to show up, to adopt the bodily postures, to commingle among these images that are literally life-size. So it's like an actual mirror for yourself, right? And there's cases where they blend characteristics. So they'll combine like articles of clothing that are worn in multiple places or different places so that you can always find yourself there. There's always something familiar, something different. In terms of the line drawings, oh God. So most of these reliefs are actually in the Louvre. Here, we're missing panels. So the reconstruction is only approximate that I gave you, that sort of a long reconstruction. And these drawings are pretty good. The ones I pulled, there's multiple versions for that specific, for Sargon's palace. There are the original drawings made on the spot, and then which I think are a little bit better in this case when you're comparing to the photos. And then there's a sort of set of engravings that was more mass produced. They're remarkably, like all things considered, the drawings are remarkably good. There are cases where we don't have the reliefs at all because like Laird uncovered at Nineveh, he actually wrote down kilometers, like miles of reliefs. And anything that wasn't pristine was not taken back to, it was just left exposed, not reburied either. So there's just like literally miles and miles of loss. It's incalculable. But in this case, I use the line drawings just for like the sort of ease of seeing. In this particular set of reliefs, we can actually look at the surviving reliefs in the Louvre. And I think the Oriental Institute has at least a couple of them. From most, the best ones the OI has are actually from a different area, the various hierarchies. But at least a little part of this is in the Oriental Institute at Chicago.
And all of those were painted.
Yes, they were painted.
So they were very colorful. And whatever is there is nothing between the figures, was some landscape, some pattern. I have a question for you about the Zoroastrian religion in general. Is that my understanding of it is that it starts somewhere in the Achaemenid period. And the first time that Parva is shown in Persepolis, where Darius started building it. And itself is a combination of some Egyptian and Assyrian bigger. Between Achaemenids and the Sasanids, you have the Parthians, and we know very little of them, but we know enough that we think that they are related to the Armenians, which I mentioned. But this process, this time, Avesta was being written.
Well, not written, but sorry.
What was it? What was it happening?
Oral memorization and recitation. Sorry, I didn't let you finish your question.
So when you categorize by religion, where do you start? Do you start where the religion was being conceived, or you start where?
I think, well, for me, that's kind of my problem with it, is that it is usually conceived of as like the entire tradition, which because it is a living one, and there are still Zoroastrians today, and because of this oral transmission, which is really conservative as far as like linguistically, like that kind of conservatism, I think, is extrapolated for the like the tradition as a whole. But that's, you know, very specific context of liturgical recitation and memorization, like performed every day and ritualized by specific priests, you know, that versus like religious practice. And I am most interested in what Zoroastrianism looks like under the Sasanians, and then what happens after the Sasanian period. It's like that break and transition. Because I mean, that's when the text that more of the text that we have, not just the Avesta, but the exegetical texts and other semi-historical and other literary texts written by Zoroastrians were written by those priests in the Islamic period, but claiming that genealogy tradition to the Sasanian period before. So I think we have to know, and like those texts shape everything we know about the tradition base. Those are how we read the Avesta and the Shahnameh later too, and its preservation of Avestan themes. But it's all about like the comparison of and this construction of identity and continuity with the past. That's what's important. So I am looking at the Sasanian period in order to understand the Islamic period, instead of just assuming this kind of continuity for the entire kind of tradition. Yeah.
Well, at that note, I'd invite us to continue these conversations with food. Thank you.